to terrorism, which is the most threatening challenge to the peace and prosperity of the region. The first session will focus on the threat of terrorism, radicalization, and what BIMSTEC countries can do collectively to meet the challenge. May now request General Rameshwar Roy, Chair Session 1, and panelists, Ambassador Shambhuram Simkhada, Major General Abdul Rashid, Mr. Sumit Nakandala, Mr. S.M. Sahai, to please take their seats on the dais. I now hand over the proceedings to General Roy. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me say that I'm humbled by the fact that chairing a session where I have such eminently qualified people to contribute to today's discussion. I would also like to thank the director, Vivekanand International Foundation, for giving me this opportunity to share some of the thoughts while chairing this session at a time when the senior citizens, the trend is, are not even listened to at home or by the younger people. So that is the other humbling experience that I have. The topic for the session 1, that is threat of terrorism, radicalization and response by BIMSTEC countries, is already well laid out, and the importance of the same has also been brought out in the morning session. While going through the morning session, I had 3 philosophical perceptions to share with you all. The first one is on relevance. When we say that we want to remain relevant individually or as a nation or as a social group, and this was said in the relevance to when America says America first, you never know, it might just land up by being America alone. So your relevance is always decided in reference to your environment. That is where it is important that we as individuals or as a nation, if we want to remain relevant, we have to remain connected to our environment. That we must recognize, rather than getting carried away by these kind of slogans that we and the only ones and no one else. Then you will not be relevant at all. The second is that the conflict situations all over for the last, I would say, ever since the dawn of civilization, have also gone through a process of mutation. You have mutation of genes, you have mutations of bacteria, you have mutations of whole lot of things. And mutation simply means that whatever is the existing environment, you mutate to a higher level, you mutate to a greater level of resistance to whatever you are facing now. If this process of mutation is not recognized by the thinking community, we will not be able to link with the factor of how so much has changed, and that change should give us a challenge rather than giving us a frustration, how to deal with it. And the last perception I have to share with you all is that a threat, be it real or imaginary, a threat is a function of your growth. Threat is a function of our growth. If we are not threatened, we will never feel necessity to grow our capabilities, and that we must recognize. Then the threat becomes a positive force to push us towards growth and enhancing our capabilities, rather than taking it negatively that our capabilities necessarily are not to fight with anybody. It is just to make us more capable to face the threats that we have in times to come. And lastly, an economic independence or economic growth will always be related to factor of being more assertive. Many nations which may not have been as assertive in the past are becoming more assertive because of their economic muscles. And that's the reason why security and economy remain at the core of entire dialogue process, all kinds of groupings and whatever else that we are trying to create, be it BIMSTEC, be it ASEAN, be it SAARC. And one point I want everybody to remember, that today's leadership at individual level, social level, regional level, world level is all about solving conflicts. We are not looking for leaders to lead us into conflict. We are looking at the leaders who will have the capability to solve the conflicts. And that is the kind of convergence we need to have while keeping the interest of each individual nations that we have. I don't think I should take much time, and without any further ado, let me invite my panelists, which are eminently qualified. Since I have the panelists sitting from right to left, I also will not be following any other sequence than right to left. Let's be right to start with. And I will invite, I will not be giving any kind of introduction because they are so eminent that the introduction is already there with you all. So let me invite Ambassador Shambhu Ram to give his presentation. And I would request them to restrict their presentations, say 12 to 15 minutes. I will not be wanting to give a tap on the table to say that your time is running out and please wind up. So let's be conscious of our time. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, very distinguished members of the panel, and Dr. Gupta, distinguished members in the audience. It's always a pleasure to come to Delhi and, of course, to BIF because it every time reminds me of the closeness of our relationship. In fact, once in a while, when I go out on conferences, the rest of the world, she says, you go. I will stay with my grandchildren. But whenever I'm going to either Varanasi or Delhi, my wife says, I'm also going. So she's here. And of course, it's such a pleasure to reconnect with some of the friends with whom I've not met for such a long time. Well, after getting, and of course, Ambassador Razan, it's always a pleasure, sir, to reconnect back again. When I got this invitation to come and participate in this dialogue, of course, subsequently, I sort of tried to conceptualize in my own mind as to what it is that I'm going to speak. But this morning, after the inaugural, Dr. Gupta's very well laid out sort of opening remarks, and the two remarks, and of course the chairman's guideline, I thought I would leave all of those aside and really engage in a dialogue. Because oftentimes I'm a bit reluctant in the South Asian context to be talking of think tanks. Because in the BIMSTEC region, if there is one thing that binds us together, it's both history and geography, time and space. And of course, no human affairs can be talked about in isolation. We must discuss them within the dynamics of time and the rigidity of space. This is the space we have. It remains. So as I was listening to the speech this morning, in fact, the BIMSTEC region was so closely tied together. But of course, these kind of organizations are not biological constructs. They are political constructs. And as a result of that political thinking, maybe for some time, we drifted in different conceptual or institutional setup. But we've come together because we are together. We live together. We face similar kind of problems. We are bound together by similar kind of cultures. And that, I think, is our biggest strength. It was very rightly pointed out that we also face similar kind of problems. And one of the most serious problems that we face is the problem of terrorism and radicalization. And when we talk about terrorism, what comes in my mind? There are a number of peoples from so many nationalities going about their business in one tall building. There are school children and teachers engaged in learning and teaching. There are tourists in a wonderful, beautiful hotel enjoying together. And there are passengers traveling on trains. What happens to all of them? They're all blown away for no fault of theirs, for no reason. That's what terrorism does to innocent people. And as a result, there has to be a resolve that it is not only an act of faithlessness in self, faithlessness in the institutions, faithlessness in society, but faithlessness in faith itself. So there cannot be any rationalization, either political, economic, religious, or any other rationalization for terrorism. And of course, any act that inspires people to kill other innocent people and sometimes themselves get killed, what is it if not an act of faithlessness? Not just in yourself, but in faith itself. So any philosophy that induces and inspires people to undertake that kind of action, called radicalization, is not acceptable, should not be accepted, and has no place in a society which is bound together. I'm open to other suggestions, but by Buddha, by Gandhi, by Tagore, by Taj Mahal, and many other such places of creation, not destruction. So in that sense, this morning, I thought I would only deal on these two issues at the level of two things. One, at the level of thought. Because where we are meeting, Vivekananda International Foundation, The great guru once said, "We are what our thoughts make us." So, what is it? What kind of a thought is it that inspires us to do that kind of thing? We must deal with terrorism at the level of thought, right at the start. Of course, exercise of power and exercise of force will be necessary to prevent and, in fact, to respond to acts of terror and radicalization. But that is only to specific acts of terror. At a larger scale, at the level of thought, it must be addressed. And there, the first thing is to project a message collectively that it is. I've often, since 9/11, I've written quite extensively about terrorism. And I describe it as man's war with himself or herself. And it's a war that must be fought together collectively. And in that sense, I'm delighted that as one of the pivotal powers in the region, that India has taken the initiative to bring us all together, to reflect, to really engage in a dialogue. First of all, to agree without any exception that it is an act that no individual, institution, and state must accept and must deal with it individually and collectively. I think that is the first at the level of thought. Of course, I'm also scheduled to speak on the way forward. And of course, the general has given me very strict instructions. When the instruction comes from the general, then you have to abide by it, of 15 minutes. The second element that I thought I would talk about is what Mahatma Gandhi said. In the race between man and power depends the future of human civilization. And here it brings me to deal with that thought of terror and, of course, these evil acts at the level of governance, relating to the exercise of power. And of course, this is a dilemma that has confronted human beings from the time immemorial to this day, as to how do we acquire power, and once we acquire that power, how do we exercise it? What do we use it for? Whether you talk of Chanakya or Confucius, Aristotle or Plato, Nehru or Lee Kuan Yew. That has been the classic dilemma of political thought in between the acquisition of power and its exercise. And therein lies the challenge, in the sense that to be able to address this issue collectively, most fundamentally at the level of thought, it must be done through effective governance. And that's where BIMSTEC, I think, is important. Of course, as I said, I will be talking a little more on the way forward as to how I feel we can address the problem that has confronted humanity for so long. In that sense, the post-World War II political order started to move beyond the classical notion of balance of power and to move towards a more collective global security, prosperity, and dignity. But had that notion succeeded, then the need for greater regionalization that were talked about this morning would not have been necessary had the UN, which was the pivotal institution created to avoid the kind of problem, the kind of pain that humanity faced in those two world wars, would have been different. But that has not happened. So, what did scholars conceptualize? That in fact, this notion of a more collective security, prosperity, and dignity was too far diffused. And as a result, nation states that are more face similar kind of problems, have similar thoughts and aspirations, would come together to deal with the problems of security, problems of prosperity, and problems of human dignity. That is how we know that different institutions were created. But if one institution becomes dysfunctional, we cannot wait forever and let the problem fester. So as a result, today we are gathered here as BIMSTEC member states, and of course, thinkers from those countries to try and see how we can come together to address this problem. And in that sense, there was something that was discussed this morning. Although I would have liked to take my hat off. I'm not speaking as anyone, as an individual. Oftentimes, I also take my jacket off because I take my diplomatic jacket off and speak as an academician. So just to convey the message that these are my own thoughts and do not represent either the country I am from or, in fact, the institution which I belong to. And one of the organizing principles of interstate relationship is the idea called national interest. This morning, Ambassador Sybil talked about the crumbling global order. In fact, very recently I was in the US, and of course, a lot of my time is spent in Barnes and Noble. And one of the most bestseller books is this one called Destined for War. And it's written by no other than Graham Allison, who, as the founding dean of the Kennedy School of Government, Harvard University, is regarded as one of the powerhouses of thinking and ideas. Now, if he is talking about destined for war, we better take those issues seriously. And in such a context, when people probably have forgotten what happened during those two great wars in Europe, and of course, with the locus of power in what we call the 21st century, shifting to Asia and in our region, how do we prepare ourselves not to get engaged and involved in those tragic events? That, I think, is another serious reflection in which we need to ponder about as representatives of think tanks. So, with this, let me simply conclude by saying that it is an issue whose time has come for us to reflect. And in these 2 days, more than anything else, I am delighted to have been invited to share these short thoughts on what I perceive is one of the most serious challenges that the world and we as members of BIMSTEC, and more than the members of BIMSTEC, we the peoples of these countries face, and as a result, how we should engage in activities to get our institutions or states to cooperate to deal with the problem. With that, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Gupta, for the invitation. Thank you so much.
I would now like to invite Major Muhammad Abdul Rashid. He is the Executive Director, Institute of Conflict, Law and Developmental Studies. Gentlemen, please note, ladies and gentlemen, please note, word law has come along with the Institute of Conflict. It simply means that there has to be some ground rules which are broken to start a conflict, and enforcement of those ground rules will go in for termination of the conflict. So now may I invite Major Abdul Rashid to give his presentation. Thank you.
Respected Chair, General Roy, the distinguished panelists and gentlemen, very good morning. I'm very happy to be here at Delhi. This is not the first time I'm here. Bangladesh and India is actually interacting since long to counter this terrorism, and for which the think tank of India and Bangladesh is working together. So for which I attended a number of talk in New Delhi. This might be my fourth or fifth one. First thing I'd like to say that Bangladesh, I don't like to have a what is the terrorism, a very concept or which our ambassador has presented. I'm basically a fighter. We had to fight at least two things. One is a secessionist movement, which is in Chittagong Hill Tracts. And I was personally a fighter. And next we faced this terrorism after that, after in the 90s, early 90s. So problem is that whenever it grows, it comes onto law enforcing agencies to curb it. Now I find there is a big gap between the common people, our strategists or civil societies, and the perception of the law enforcing agencies how to counter it. Now, most of the civil societies, we have found that it is ideological war, so it must be fought ideologically. Then they say that we must have a counter narrative and make the people understand that not to eat this poison of religion. But I started searching as a researcher to find what could be the counter narrative. Still, I have not found a good counter narrative which can defeat the terrorism. So that's the big problem. And so the law enforcer, they apply force, and that also create an opposition from the civil society. That's a big what is the dilemma, and that ties the hands politically, that ties the hands of the general to fight the battle. So that's the problem. I'm from Bangladesh. You know, the Bangladesh is a success story to fight the terrorism, and also the secessionist movement in Chittagong Hill Tracts. Now, why we are talking about that is a problem for the everybody, and we must respond together. So our response to whatever we have done about the countering terrorism and the secessionist movement, we found that we had a tremendous cooperation that we received from India. So that made us possible to curb those threats. So as we have entered in the bigger canvas, that's the BIMSTEC, we know that threat, this ideology, it has a mobility. And more we are talking about connectivity or infrastructural connectivity, it is not only bringing the people together, business together, trade or commerce together, or it is giving a prosperity, it is also giving an opportunity to the terrorist ideology to travel faster. So we have to think that only infrastructure development and connectivity, this ideology must not be able to travel. So to cut his speed, then we have to act together. So that's the importance that BIMSTEC must act together to counter the terrorism. Now in Bangladesh, we found that I like to share our experience, since I said that we are a success story. Being a Muslim Sunni country, Bangladesh is the only country which has sufficiently curbed the terrorism, religious terrorism, and how they have done it. I just like to give that as a food for thought. Again, as the ambassador said that I have to come again to find a way forward and make some recommendations that will do. So as we see that we entered now in Bangladesh about the terrorism, we call it a fourth generation terrorism. The first generation we experienced those people from the Palestine fighter. They came back to Bangladesh and they started. That was the first and very small terrorist organization came up. The second generation was very heavy. That is the Afghan fighters. Those came back to Bangladesh and formed the first organization, the Huji, Harkatul Jihad al Islami in Bangladesh. So they actually started attacking innocent people. The ambassador said they are killing the innocent people, and they have made the largest attack on the our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina on 21st August, about in 2005, 4. So that's was the most important attack they could do. Now, next generation, we have seen that after immediately before development of the IS, so we had another organization outfit known as JMB. So do we have a JMB? Is a two types. One is a new JMB and the old JMB. And JMB the network, it actually we found that after the Bardhaman blast in India, we found that they established network across the border also. So that we found that once the law enforcer chased them out, they just crossed the border and took the shelter, and they're trying to make the bomb at Bardhaman and again putting it inside Bangladesh. So how then we have to act together, and then that network, I am sure now it is uprooted. And there are a lot of information exchange were taken place at that time between India and Bangladesh, for which we could uproot that network. And then we found that network, another came up, Neo JMB, which actually did the very big attack on our diplomatic area in Dhaka city. That's called Holy Artisan attack, where about 23 people were killed, mostly foreigners, including one Indian, I guess, if I'm not wrong. So that in Neo JMB, why we need to act together? That first thing is that we forget about Huji, the latest one, the attacker. They are the young people. They are from the elite class society. That's another problem that we came up. Earlier, we thought that the madrasa, which is a seminaries where they teach the only Islamic education, so terrorists were coming from that source. Suddenly, after the attack, we found that most of the attackers were from the private universities and from the English medium school. Now, how it shifted? So then we started researching why it has shifted. We started talking to the students and trying to find out. Then we found that the growth of the terrorism is very important. That which kind of political party is in power. So that is one of the important aspects. That's we call it a state actor. So we found that Bangladesh 3 or 4 generation all actually developed, spawned during a political regime. So regime is very important. Now, if we have, then we see again in the South Asian context, we have found that some of the threats which India faces, the same threat also Bangladesh experiences, which comes from, we normally call it our is from Pakistan. So state actor, how they are going to act. If the member state keep on acting and supporting or destabilizing other country, that is a part of their foreign policy, then it is very difficult to curb the terrorism. So that is one of the important issues, that once we group together, polarize together, we must make our place, that we must not be able to, as a state actor, must not be able to support the terrorism or their ideology. So Bangladesh has huge number of growth of seminaries suddenly. Then we found where from they got the money. Then we found that Sunni monarchs of Middle East, they gave pushed in a lot of money for those seminaries to grow. So they would like to change the whole social fabric, social structure, and tolerance and intolerance, everything together, and ultimately they got a lot of fighters. So that is one important, how the finance goes. Now, if we make a group or a BIMSTEC or whatever it is, then automatically all the countries, all the member countries must make a commitment that they must not be able to finance terror. Terrorist financing must be curbed, and any portion of the world, because terrorism is not isolated from the geopolitical interest. So automatically there are some country in the world they do support. So we have to also act together to curb or to uh, prevent their support for the terrorism, whether it is for India, whether it is against for Bangladesh, or for any member countries of Bay of Bengal. So that place we need to have it, because that is the way we can make a better fight. Bangladesh did fought with the support of the almost many friendly countries. Otherwise, it would not have been possible. Then it is there's another problem that the most of the Holy artisan attackers, we found that the leader came from Canada. He is a diaspora, Bangladeshi diaspora. He left, when he was a child, and brought up in Canada, and then he came back, and then he organized the Neo JM. So we have to keep a track that which country, if Canada has could have cooperated with Bangladesh about his movements and tracking him, I guess we could have avoided that one. So automatically our member countries, we have said that it is very contiguous. It is a connectivity. So it is a Bay of Bengal region is a very close region and very closely knitted. So automatically we have to exchange our information, and anywhere the threat is spawning, we must be able to warn the objective threat object country that something danger going for you. So automatically this sort of cooperation we have to build up, and for which we say we act together, not in isolation. If we act in isolation, probably we may not get the success. The country in the South Asia we have found, it is no undenying fact, though I am sure there is no member from here, member is here from Pakistan. So we see that a good number of people do help from Pakistan as a state actor. Yeah, even Bangladesh has apprehended one of the embassy officials who was financing the terror group. So this is an example. I said I'm sharing Bangladesh experience because this is a food for thought. When we'll make the response, we have to make a response in this line, because we have achieved some success. Now success started getting once we had a regime who did not support, who was a zero tolerance for the against the terrorism. That's our Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina. So automatically, that from there we started achieving the success. So I told the regime is important. We have to see the terror must not be financed, and there is many kinds of financing ways. I'm not going into those details. So that is important. Another is um, they do have enjoyed the political protection. I said when the terrorists were came into conflict with the law enforcer, so automatically there were casualties of the terrorists. The police have killed so far active terrorists. About 85 active terrorists have been killed by the Bangladeshi police in their 35 operations. So, is those killings will be considered as extrajudicial killing? So they say, why did you kill them? Why have you not captured them and brought them under law? So I don't know, as a law enforcer, how could I go in the face of bullet and capture a terrorist alive and bring them to the law? So that's a big challenge. These intricacies created all the problems. So again, there is a shout. So some political parties do raise voice that law enforcers, whoever has killed the terrorist, he has killed an innocent people. It is extrajudicial killing. He should be tried. So these are the dilemma how to solve it. I think I'm just sharing these sort of things because we have to come up with a common solution so that it is accepted by the people. Uh, Another one is that very important is the public support. We must be able to tell them what is our just cause, why we are fighting, because they are killing innocent people. Bangladesh people has shown their resilience to for this fight, and ultimately we have got the success. So these important things, if we make some solutions in the BIMSTEC think tank area and come up with some way ahead, I think we'll always make a success. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, General Rashid. May I now request Mr. Sumit, Additional Secretary, MUFA, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Sri Lanka, to give his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fellow panelists, thank you very much, Dr. Aravind Gupta, for inviting me. In fact, we started this process 21st March 2017. I have been privileged to work with you, Dr. Gupta, when we convened the first National Security Advisors meeting in New Delhi. I'm also very happy to see my two directors from the Secretariat here, Director Pankaj and Director Shering. We, in fact, just to give a small narrative, there was a mention of, that BIMSTEC was established in 1997. We have spent 21 years. What are the stock and the net outcome? Now, I'll talk in relevance to the topic today. Now, counterterrorism and transnational crime is part of the 14 areas of cooperation identified by the 7 member states. Now, under that, we have certain structure, joint working group on CTTC, and then we have number of subgroups. I think we have enlarged the subgroups. We have increased subgroup, including subgroup on violent extremism and radicalization. That decision came from the BIMSTEC retreat, which was held in Goa, 16th October 2016. I think all in all, we have had some kind of momentum in order to address the terrorism. How do we tackle terrorism? How do we respond? I think Ambassador told, and then both General also tried to explain how do we respond to the terrorism. First, before that, we need to understand what the terrorism is, what the sources of terrorism is, and how do we respond collectively and regionally. We have the BIMSTEC Convention on International Terrorism signed by everybody, but I think two countries, one country is yet to ratify. So it has taken considerable time for the member states also not only to sign but also to ratify. Unless you ratify the convention, there won't be any legal effect. That is number one. Secondly, we developed, I think we have finalized almost in 2015, BIMSTEC Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance. I don't think it was signed during the last summit. So these are gaps that we need to do. We also need another 2 conventions which we have been negotiating, BIMSTEC Convention on Extradition and BIMSTEC Convention on Transfer of Sentenced Persons. These are legal framework on which we can respond. The collective, the regional cooperation is not based on the just a political communique. But I submit to you that we need sufficient legal, implementable, and pragmatic legal framework. Now, if you see the structure adopted by other regional organizations, ASEAN, EU, and some of the regional organizations in Africa and South America, this is the basis. This has to be thought and implement. Now, in order to do that, I think the political will and the commitment is important. Now, when I took over BIMSTEC Secretariat as the first Secretary General in 2014, I was looking for a leader because I knew very well without a leader, no regional organization will work. Now, that is the experience with ASEAN, that's the experience with EU, that's the experience in COMESA or whatever regional organization. So I was having frequent discussions with Mrs. Preeti Saran, the wife of Ambassador Pankaj Saran, who spoke in the morning, and she was the Secretary East. BIMSTEC subject came under Secretary East. So that's how we worked very hard in order to create this BIMSTEC retreat in 2016. That was the turning point for BIMSTEC. I think from there till the 4th summit, which was held in Kathmandu, The secretariat worked very hard. In fact, we left a remarkable impact on the work that we started since 2014. I was very happy Dr. Gupta brought mentioning crossing Bay of Bengal by Sunil Amrit. I think everybody who would like to work around Bay of Bengal must read that book, Crossing Bay of Bengal by Sunil Amrit. That history is important. That history is important because we are not in the exercise of reinventing the past. We are simply rediscovering our common heritage. The whole thing around the Bay of Bengal is a part of common heritage. Now, how do we respond to new threats is based on our common heritage. That is one of the suggestions from my own experience. The other book which you might consider is Sanjay Sanyal's latest book. That is also important. Historically, Sri Lanka was not an isolated landmass. 7,000 years before present, Sri Lanka and southern India had a visible landmass. Now, this evidence comes from the well-known archaeologists in Sri Lanka as well as in India. So these are important historical matters which we need to understand. Mr. Chairman, we also need to understand the non-traditional security threats. Not only terrorism, but I think it is important that we focus on non-traditional security threats, especially the challenges posed by climate change. Now, these are important things because the magnitude of climate change and its impact can erase civilizations, populations, and they can shift populations. They will have a very serious impact. Now, how do we do this? We need to take non-traditional security threats as very serious. And already, I think IPCC has prepared a number of models. We need to work with them. I think Dr. Gupta will remember that your suggestion to create a Himalayan Science Council is an important matter. Himalayan Science Council. I think the whole concept was misunderstood by some of the member states. But I would like you to take it again. Himalayan Science Council. It is nothing to do with Himalaya per se. It's the word that Dr. Gupta has coined. In fact, it is his creation, so that this Himalayan Science Council can look into the impact of climate change in Bay of Bengal. That is one suggestion from me. How do we address the threat of terrorism? The other important one is that the document which we have released in 21st March 2017 is a very powerful document. That document is a very holistic and powerful. That was the outcome of the first National Security Advisors meeting. There was a very important distinction, Mr. Chairman. The document identifies Bay of Bengal as common security space. Now, what does it mean? The common security space. That identification itself provides the member states to work together. Now, that has to be, I think that has to be taken very seriously. In fact, that idea came from Dr. Aravind Gupta. I am very happy that we readily agreed with that submission. The other important matter is, while countering terrorism and responding, we need the real-time intelligence. Now, we don't have a system of doing that. This is unless and until we have a framework on how the member states share the vital intelligence, I don't think the real cooperation will come. Cooperation is there bilaterally. Of course, we have excellent cooperation with the government of India. We work with them. We have a long history to to deal with the vital intelligence between India and Sri Lanka. But regionally, how do we do that? To what extent that we share intelligence? What is the structure? Now, this is important. Now, government of Sri Lanka has suggested I think in 2014, in the subgroup on intelligence sharing, which Sri Lanka is chairing, that lead shepherd. We have submitted the concept note, BIMSTEC structure on intelligence sharing. This is something that we can revisit, and unless we have a firm structure on intelligence sharing, which means that you trust each other. The trust between the two members or more is absolutely important in order to respond to terrorism collectively. You can respond to terrorism within a nation state, but then how do you do this? Your enemy is also our enemy at the end of the day. So this should be taken in that context, and it is not only the terrorism which we need to focus. What I just mentioned as an example, non-traditional security threats, then climate change, even obesity is a threat. Obesity is a threat because if you have a sick population, type 2 or type 1 diabetes and other things, not only obesity, but there are a number of, yes. So what we need to do when you talk about regional security, what about human security, food security, nutrition security? Now, this is a huge agenda for the think tanks to work on. As Dr. Gupta said, policy advice to the member states through BIMSTEC Secretariat, and collectively bring all the experts together on vital matters is the challenge we have ahead us. And I am also happy Vivekananda International Foundation, together with the National Security Secretariat of India, convening this meeting. As discussed, we would like to see continuation of this process. When we meet next for the second meeting, I think all the member states should make some progress on how do we respond to the terrorism, not only terrorism, but also regional security issues. I'm not going to narrowly focus on terrorism, but since our mandate is to look into regional security, I think we need to have a holistic view and pragmatic view and deliverables. Now, how do we deliver? That's the important thing. I would like to leave these thoughts with you for further deliberation. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit, for not allowing me to tap the table, which, as it is not a very pleasant experience. Now, may I invite Mr. Sahai, who is the Additional Secretary with the NSCS, to give his presentation.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. General Roy and my fellow panelists. I must admit that in the course of the last 45 minutes, we've had the opportunity of listening to the concepts as well as the practical and pragmatic application of cooperation as would need to be practiced by the countries of the BIMSTEC. Well, with the subject of terrorism and the threat of terrorism, I think what we will need to appreciate foremost is that this threat is not going to go away unless some countries do not stop practicing this as an instrument of state policy. When we talked about the change of the global order after World War II, we also need to examine what has now come to challenge what was conceived as the Westphalian model of the sovereign state. The new world order of globalization that actually became from an aspect of trade has now converted and become far more voluminous and far more uh, quicker, speedier by the information age. So the global connect that is now taking place in the information age, that is going to make things much faster and a bigger challenge. And one of the biggest challenges that has come out of the information age is the challenge of terrorism. How, as countries, are we going to deal with that is basically the challenge that most of us are going to face. The truth about the BIMSTEC countries is that we have got the problem of development because we have got a problem of the youth bulge. And we all know from history and its lessons that any country that has increased the population by about 25% in its male population in the younger age group has turbulence. And we all have populations which have got now where the age group below 30 is almost close to 60-65%. So I think these are some of the issues that the socio-economic factors that which we need to look into if we are going to want to fight the issue of radicalization. We all know that there are forces which are at work, whether it is with the Rohingyas in the Rohingya camps, and we find that in the JMB in Bangladesh, whether it is with the terrorist organizations which are in India, or with there are the populations which are on the borders of Nepal, which are suddenly coming up, or the borders of Bangladesh that are suddenly coming up. These are all being fed by a particular agency in a particular country, and I think that mention has been already made by my colleague from Bangladesh. So if we are going to defeat forces like that, we have to be conscious of the fact of what is happening within our countries. Apart from that, we have to also understand that what is the new global dynamic of terrorism. The epicenter that was there initially in Syria has now shifted into our neighborhood, and which is in the AFPAC region. What is exactly happening in Afghanistan and what is happening in its neighborhood in Pakistan's northern areas? The concentration of what was initially groups that were meant to fight the Russians and what have they converted into? So these threats are going to become threats for us. Whether they come to threats directly into our territories through the land borders, or whether they are ideologically through the internet into Southeast Asia. Because we are, I'm sure, conscious of the fact that whether it is Thailand or Indonesia, whether it's the Philippines, and the Philippines has had seen very big problems of late, as to where is that emanated from, including Central Asia. So, but in the BIMSTEC countries, we have a common problem. And that common problem is, as I said, that it's from our neighborhood. The suggestions made by the rep from Sri Lanka, I think, were very valid, that we need to have real time and real cooperation. But having said that, you may put in place the legal processes, you may have intelligence sharing, but where does the challenge lie? The challenge actually does not lie in fighting the terrorism. The challenge actually lies in managing the peace. And if you are not, as a country, able to do that, that is, you will always leave a residual issue. And the residual issue will erupt again. And that is, I think, the primary thing that most of our countries need to focus on, because once the problem gets over, we want to move on to the next best thing, what are actually resolving what was left behind. And if you look at it, most of the problems that we find that are there in our countries are actually what is a challenge of subnationalism. And those subnational challenges that were created for various reasons, but they may have a feudal background to it, whether it was relocation of populations for certain political purposes or for certain economic purposes, or whether it was the relocation of populations for even things like carrying out agriculture or other economic activities. But those populations began to get an identity. Now, when I talked about the Westphalian model, I was wanting to bring point as to why was the Westphalian model being challenged today. The reason for its challenge is basically that you wanted to create a monolith sovereign state. But that monolith sovereign state must accommodate the subnational identities. Till yesterday, you could suppress it But today, with the information age, the new era, the way information flows, and the challenge of the diaspora, for example, now those challenges will reignite that subnationalism and create those sub-identities, which will become a challenge to the sovereign state. So the accommodation of those populations, whether it is political, economic, or social, that is one of the biggest things that the BIMSTEC countries have to understand. And that is where I think the great advantage that we have got will come into play, and that is the common heritage. We have got almost a similar DNA. We've got very similar cultural links. The king of Thailand still is called Ram. I think the current one is Ram the Seventh. His capital is called Ayodhya. And that's the cultural linkage. We are not, I mean, so these are the interplays that have taken place. These are the cultural cross currents that are there between Sri Lanka and India, between India and Bangladesh. Of course, India and Nepal, nothing has to be discussed. It's all there. Everybody knows about it. But the question is that how do we appreciate and understand that? And how do we accommodate those sub-identities and those sub-nationalisms within our larger monolithic state while we are trying to preserve the Westphalian sovereign state? That is something that we need to understand and appreciate if we do not want to face the issue of terrorism. Because terrorism is what today? It is basically an assertion of that identity, which can very easily be exploited by any other country. And it is being done. Then what is it as governments and as countries are we willing to take on? While it is very easy to say that we, as a country, we must stop it, but are we immune from the temptation of actually exploiting this or not? And that is where the fundamental lies. It does not lie anywhere else. Countries will have their internal problems. They'll have internal decisions. There will be issues of economic disparity. There will be issues of lack of aspirations. But the question is that if as countries we respect the fact that we will not interfere, which is the original charter of the Westphalian model, if you recall, that when the treaty took place, it was that you will respect the sovereignty of other countries. So going back in time, we must understand that this is where the whole challenge lies, about it not being used as an instrument of state policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sai. I think once again, finishing well in time. Now, before, gentlemen, first of all, let me say that we could not have had a more balanced point of view to this problem of terrorism and radicalization and responses that have been shared by various countries. So, may I request you to give a big round of applause to the panelists? While Sumit mentioned about obesity, the clapping itself, it helps you do away with the heart disease. So every morning, if you do it for 10 minutes, and if you attend these kind of seminars where you are liberal in clapping, it would amount to around 10 minutes because there are 4 to 5 sessions in every session, you know. So please be liberal with this. Now, before I open the floor uh, for questions and answers by the panelists, may I request individuals not to give your comments because we already are, despite strict timekeeping, we are already off by 10 minutes. And please just restrict to questions. It's a very well-informed audience. Everybody is aware of what is happening. You have heard some elaborations on whatever is going on. So one does not require to explain whatever questions you wish to ask. But before I do that, it is part of my responsibility as a chair to just give one bullet point each, which have to be taken care of as you walk away from this for lunch, as to what do I feel are the takeaways. The first takeaway is that it is the failing of the global responsibilities and the global institutions which has pushed us into looking for regional solution to what was said in 9/11, that it is a global war on terrorism. Till today, there is no single definition that one has come up with. One can imagine what kind of a consensus can emerge in times to come to fight this menace. Hence, it is at regional level. The second, before this issue of hard power application comes in, you know, the entire process of this radicalization and the threat travels through many stages. And in that many stages, if we can have a good governance, if we can have a happier society, and only Bhutan in their constitution have got this index of happiness. No other country in the world has got that as part of a constitutional responsibility by the leaders who lead the countries. So, good governance and a happy society is one criteria, because any plethora of literature which is available on terrorism, nowhere have I come across, or anybody would have come across, as to how a terrorist gets formed. You can see the spectrum from educated to the most developed societies to the least developed societies. The range is there limitless. So therefore, what is ultimate is the governance with good, happy societies. The third is that whatever you do, unless you have the law of the land or law of the entire framework, as Sumit said, that framework is not only ratified, it is not only correct in legal terms, and every country would have their own law of the land. So that convergence is required. And more than that, the strict implementation of such a law, and defaulter must be punished. In the army, we say that an obstacle created is absolutely ineffective till it is covered by fire. Likewise, any law, if you don't implement, what's the point in having a law? Most of the countries which are developing have this major problem that laws are there, but this is not possible to implement them. What's the point in having them then? So that's a next takeaway. And another takeaway is that non-traditional security threats. Now, as we progress more and more, the non-traditional security threats would emerge. Somebody in the morning, Mr. Sibal had mentioned about the cyber. There are many. Climate is, for example, one of them. And climate, just one example. We have pushed up the Earth's temperature to 0.75 degrees in last 100 years. If we push it that much more in next 100 years, I think 14 odd coastal cities may disappear because of the rise in water level temperatures. And if this doesn't sound very alarming, the Siachen temperature itself has gone up by 17 degrees just in one place, if you don't take the global average of 0.75. So likewise, there are many other takeaways which are there. I will not go over all of them, but the final point is that the trans-border connectivity with the is very important. The trans-border connectivity is very important, and at the same time, we can draw from our civilizational connect that we have. It has been mentioned by the various speakers also, and that is the biggest strength we have to find the regional solution to this menace in the framework of BIMSTEC, and we would like to wish it all the best. Now, floor is open for questions. Please specify your question to a particular speaker if you wish to. Otherwise, by default, then I will have to come in, and I'm no specialist than the people sitting over here. Yes, sir, please.
Thank you. My question is to Ambassador Nakandira. In terms of the response to terrorism and those challenges, what has been your experience as Secretary General? I mean, you headed the Secretariat of BIMSTEC, and how actually, let's say, how you function, so to say, and what lessons one can draw from your experience as to how BIMSTEC as an organization, including the structures of BIMSTEC, how they can actually respond to this threat effective thing.
Thank you. It is a very difficult question to answer, but I hope that my two directors will help me in framing a response. Now, Secretary General's role is to maintain the Secretariat and then facilitate the meetings and provide documentation. That is very clear in the initial the MOU on the establishment of the Secretariat. In order to respond to you, I know what is behind this question. In fact, if BIMSTEC is to be a very meaningful, relevant organization, I think Secretariat also should be part of the finding solution. I am not aware whether such kind of measure is in. Of course, EU is quite different. EU can call for sanctions and call for certain embargoes and other things, issues related to international terrorism and support for international terrorism. But we in the BIMSTEC Bay of Bengal and the BIMSTEC Secretariat, we have not gone thus far. That is why I raised this issue. In 2009, we signed the BIMSTEC Convention on International Terrorism and Transnational Crime and Drug. Yes. So 2009 during the third BIMSTEC summit. But now we are now in 2018. I think Secretariat had sent number of reminders for that single member state to ratify it. It has not happened. So that's the kind of situation we are. In order for Secretariat to respond on the matters related to terrorism, I think Secretariat must be one is it should be strengthened. It should have international legal personnel housed inside, and it should also work with the member states very closely. We are doing, of course, our role is limited. My experience is rather disappointing because we could not sign this BIMSTEC Convention on Mutual Legal Assistance. Now that is something very disappointing because everything has been finalized. I remember in 2015 when we had the joint working group on CTTC, we finalized the text. We completely finalized, and then we asked the member states to get the internal procedures done through cabinet approvals and other things. So that has not happened. So what we need to tell the member states, if you need 7 member states, if they need a regional response to terrorism, I think we need to work together closely, robustly, actively. That's the need of the hour. Thank you.
Thank you, Sumit. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
My question is to Ambassador Shamburam. If good governance is a barrier to radicalization, then how do you explain the recruits from the Scandinavian countries going to join Islamic State, or the rise of neo-Nazism, not in Eastern Europe, but in Western European countries over the last couple of years? Thank you.
You pose, in fact, perhaps the single most serious issue that those of us involved in addressing the menace of terrorism face, in the sense that while you can rationalize one set of activity through certain examples, but there are other set of forces working around. So what listening through the debate, and of course I've been involved in the CTED, the Security Council Directorate on Terrorism, for the last 20 years. And in that sense, if BIMSTEC is to move forward, our activities must be understood at all levels of individual, institution, and state behavior. In the sense that, there is a book called Commonwealth by a very well-known professor, Jeffrey Sachs, whose name you've all heard. He was well known partly because he was the advisor to Kofi Annan on the Millennium Development Goals. In fact, the Millennium Development Goals were his brainchild. Writing a foreword in his book, another equally well-known Harvard professor writes, and he said, "We exist in a bizarre combination of Stone Age emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. This is how we have lurched into what we call the 21st century." When I was with the UN, for instance, at one time, every UN speech started with the idea saying end of the Cold War. Then when 9/11 came, everybody says after 9/11, the world will not be the same. What happened? 9/11 in New York, little bit later in Bombay, little bit earlier in Madrid, little bit earlier in Beslan. The same things are repeating. Why? Because at the level of individuals, at the level of institutions, and at the level of the highest institutional arrangement that humankind has so far conceptualized, called the nation state, our behavior is inconsistent with the dynamics of time and technology. And that is why, right at the beginning, I said you cannot engage in a discourse of human affairs without looking at the dynamics of time, but rigidity of space. So as a result, yes, you're right, in the sense that while there are good governance in some Scandinavian countries in some form, what conditions human mind is the complexity that we are dealing with terrorism. So that is why at the right, precisely when what you say, I mean, what motivates perfectly rational, educated young men and women from even developed countries to engage in the kinds of activities that the IS undertakes? It's very irrational. So that is one part. The second and very important, when Mr. Sai was talking, there were so many things going on in my mind, in the sense that when he raised the issue of sovereignty and the very notion of the Westphalian state. A state is again a political construct of how best to manage human affairs. What we are seeing in Europe is a evolution of the classical state system in terms of sharing of sovereignty upwards through an upward evolution. In fact, they're now talking about a joint military in Europe. And then devolving downwards to the level of the individual, in the sense that the European Court of Human Rights supersedes the verdict of all Council of Europe Supreme Courts. So you be bringing down, when it comes to the level of the individual rights, to the individual. So as a result, we have to transform ourselves, both in terms of thinking, in terms of addressing the problem through the ideas, and of course, institutionally supporting those ideas. And the biggest problem that I see is, are we able to address the very notion of sovereignty that with which we hold everything so dear? And yet, unless you do that, technologically, the paradox, the technology has become godlike. It has empowered the individual so much that what we thought were classically the domain of the nation state, in fact, the individual can now challenge it. So unless you address this dichotomy of how you address classical national interest through what I call an idea of greater harmonization of national interest among the member states, the practical things that we need, for instance, the sharing of intelligence, which is so critical. Unless there is a greater harmonization, nation states are not going to do it, because they will feel that it does not help their individual national interests. So it's a very complex set of issues that we are engaged in discussing. And of course, this dialogue, I like the format. Why? Because don't expect us to redress this problem in one 15-minute session. What it calls for is, in fact, this is a wonderful beginning, but in fact, it must be continued with a much deeper reflection on the behavior, as I said, of the individual, us as individuals, our institutions, and of course, how the nation states of tomorrow are going to interface each other. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yeah, okay. So please. I'll come back to you.
It's not a question, so I hope you'll allow me to just make a very short comment. I think firstly, all the presentations were brilliant. and they have touched upon some very, very important issues. And where, how firstly we should conceptualize the problem and how we should resolve it. One idea which is also there in the fourth summit and in the BIMSTEC thinking, but I think which we need to perhaps talk a little bit more, is this idea of a civilizational closeness. And when I say civilizational, I talk about several civilizations, because there are Hindu civilization, Buddhist, Islam, and so on. Now, in a separate track, people have been talking about dialogue amongst civilizations, etc. And the UN also has been supporting and so on. And I think a different set of people come together and they talk to each other, some ideas come out, etc. And in these kind of forum, it's the strategic thinkers, the law enforcement agencies, the diplomats, generals, and many others who come together. But I think the link that if you have to resolve a problem, the model in Europe, or even for that matter the UN, it may give you a certain pointers, but whether it will succeed or no is a very big issue. And I think Mr. Sahai raised this issue of accommodating sub-nationalism in overall the concept of a Westphalian state. And you talked about sovereignty. I think the whole notion of sovereignty itself, it is under a major attack. And even in Europe, European court, etc., they may not, there are many people who are rebelling, and we do not know what will happen to Europe. Coming back to our region, can our own philosophical heritage, and I'm not talking of religion in a narrow sense, can our own philosophical heritage, which goes back to 5,000 years ago, and which predates these ideas of a Westphalian state and all that, but it has something which has kept these civilizations together and continuing and full of dynamism. Now, we have to pull out ideas from there and see at least some of them, whether they are applicable here to this. And in this context, in 2015, Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe, they supported a dialogue called Samvad, which took place, which was a Hindu-Buddhist essentially, but others also came in. People of Christian faith, Islamic faith, and many others came in. And it was not just religion only. People from all disciplines came. And we had a very good meeting here in this hall. And then it's been followed by 4 other meetings in different parts of the conflict avoidance and environmental consciousness. Something, which probably all that we are talking today is subsumed in that. Many ideas have come out from those kind of discussions. But I think those ideas also have to be brought in our strategic discussions. And similarly, the difficulties of cooperation, which many of you have mentioned, in terms of we are not able to talk to each other, information sharing is an issue, and so many other issues. These also must go back to those people who are thinking philosophically, and some kind of a holistic view has to be done, because the problems of the region have to be solved. Many of them are of local thing. Subnationalism was mentioned. And I think we must really start thinking in new ways. And this is the new way that, go back to our heritage and see what is good in that heritage, and see that heritage which has, helped us survive for such a long. And this will be a very different thinking compared to what is happened in the West, etc. So I think the Western ideas are probably, they are all great ideas. Many of them are great ideas, and we swear by them. But are they sufficient for solving today's problems? New ideas need to come.
Thank you, sir. Yes, somebody had a question here. I think this is the last one. Please.
I'm Lieutenant Nehal. I'm from the National Maritime Foundation. I had a question for General Rashid as well as Additional Secretary, if your comments could be made on this. Of late, India has closely associated sharing its space technology, especially satellites, with the neighborhood. I would like the comments whereas security aspects are concerned. Has it been worked on ground? Are there some imprints being seen, like vessel movements which are taking place in the Bay of Bengal, closer to Sri Lanka, or probably the border alignment issues, which are very well being addressed through space technology? Are these benefits being drawn at these countries, or is there any aspiration from India to work on this furthermore to fill up that gap of security concerns. Thank you.
Yes, Sumit, you respond? Okay.
I view part of this case. Dr. Gupta, I think there was a mention about space cooperation in the declaration. Yeah, that final document talks about. That is why I said that document, first NSA meeting outcome document, is a very powerful tool if we really want to implement that. Many things, actually, the document is a very futuristic. It's I, around 60% is based on science and technology. So space cooperation we have identified. Now India has a SARC satellite project. SARC satellite project is there. South Asia satellite project. So is it SARC or South Asia?
No, the next one.
Yeah. So space technology, I think bilaterally we are getting benefits from India in weather satellites and other communication satellites. By and large, we do not use communication satellites because of the expensive nature. But the Bay of Bengal connectivity, undersea submarine cables, that is what we are using for communication and connectivity. I don't see any problem in that. India is providing that unilaterally, that support. India would like to share some of the resources. Our experience from Sri Lanka is that we always get the assistance from India on satellite technology, including infrared imagery we get. In addition to that, government of Japan will provide us 2 Doppler radars, weather satellites. That will be done another 3 years time. But in order to answer your question, I think we have a very good optimal cooperation with India on satellite technology. Thank you.
Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. In the closing part, I would just like to share 2 experiences of mine. One is to do with the information and intelligence. I have also been part of military intelligence through my career. And when I joined this organization, we used to have information dissemination on need-to-know basis. Let me tell you what has changed in last 4 decades. It's a CIA document which says, the days of need to know are over. Today, you need to tell. It is not the information, the way it exists, which is important. It is how will it get processed, with what all other connects would that information get linked, and how would that be used. Today's technology, this has come enough that we got the God's technology. Everybody is like, the Hindu civilization said that there is a God within each one of us. You have to realize it. It's nearly getting realized through technology that everybody is equally empowered. Today we are fighting not news, fake news. So the point here is that it is not the information sharing and having a large platform of the database which connects these nations which are trying to fight the scourge of terrorism. It is how that information will be used is more important. So let us not get apprehensive on the process of sharing the information or keeping a huge data bank of the common information. Let me compliment my friend from Bangladesh that ever since this dispensation in both the countries, I think we have had such excellent relations of sharing of information that our northeastern region is nearly as peaceful as anything. I mean, what is existing is purely in political form, but otherwise it is very peaceful. So that is one great example which can be given that if trans-border connectivity combined with good neighbor relations we maintain, I think that's key to having these areas peaceful. And the other thing which is being missed over is the sub-nationalism. I just have a data here that as per the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR report, by the end of 2017, it's a bit of old data, we are into 18, as many as 68.5 million individuals were forcibly displaced worldwide as a result of prosecution, war, conflict, political violence, and human rights violations. And this figure is an increase of 2.9 million in just 1 year. Now, the people who go to other countries, they are carrying with them the herd sentiments, their own culture, their own language, their own everything. And they want to keep it going, they want to maintain it. Existence of Tibetans in this country is one example. There could be many that can be quoted. And these kind of subnationalism is going to surface as these people get more and more embedded into a foreign land and a foreign society where they have gone. And if that is not built into the governance system of these countries, we are into big problem. Here we have an advantage in BIMSTEC of the common heritage, civilizational heritage. We must encash on it. And last point is, once again, related to philosophy. If you go up in the air, to some distance, you can see probably this is India, this is Bangladesh, this is Nepal or whatever. But as you keep going higher and higher, very much higher, will be just one round called Earth. Likewise, when you evolve yourself to those levels in knowledge and understanding, then you will start seeing the uniformity of things rather than uh, disuniformity, or rather than the divisive forces. You'll start seeing the unity, and that's exactly what is required, and that's what BIMSTEC is one such platform. Slowly and slowly, and let's imagine that in times to come, not only BIMSTEC, I mean the other nations would start linking up with this, because this model will, start proliferating in that manner. Let's have those kind of wishes. Once a big hand to a panelist, and we break off for lunch.
Session 1 panel for the thought-provoking insights and recommendations to address the pressing issue of terrorism and radicalization. We will now break for lunch, which will be served at the portico on ground floor. The second session will commence at 2 p.m. Thank you so much.
Lunch.